Stoa is a digital campfire where we cohere in dialogue about what matters most at the knife's edge of what's happening now.
So, I want to say a little anecdote, which is, in correspondence with Peter, many times I've charged him with being an intellectual. I've said, you're an intellectual. We all, but he denies that label. And I guess he's an aspiring intellectual, perhaps, or just a kind of, philosophical hobbyist. And I think there's some fruitful and benign aspects of that, but I also think it's very dangerous potentially when it comes to kind of the compromises that have to be made and what I call cop-outs that different people make when it comes to, whether they speak up about injustice or stay silent. So I encourage everybody to join that fight. And I reviewed my talk last night to prep for this, and kind of to my surprise, in talking half an hour, I actually covered a lot of the ground that I wanted to, cover today, and I don't want to retread it. So if you're interested, I urge you to go back and watch that if you haven't seen it, just to sort of catch up to this point, because it is a good primer. And kind of despite that being my first kind of practice of that kind of lecture, I think it went pretty well. The problem, though, is that I feel like it didn't gain traction. It didn't make an impact how it was supposed to, how I hoped. I challenged certain people. In that talk, I refer to kind of the meta critiques I've made in long form to spaces like the intellectual dark web, to integral theory spaces, to game B, and to Rebel Wisdom to some extent, but the Emerge network that I've been a part of and Rebel Wisdom is also part of. And the talk I gave 6 months ago wasn't really a crackdown. It was kind of an introduction to the topic, a chance for me to introduce myself. And I was hoping that it would, transition into something and we'd have a more kind of constructive summer. At any rate, kind of it didn't go as I intended after, and I did follow up about a month after that session with this long form article on anti-intellectualism. So that's what I'm going to be talking about today. And the article, according to Medium, it's a 35-minute read. And that's if you're reading it in your head. If I was to read it out loud, it would take like an hour. So we don't really have time to go through all the details of it. But I did also have 2 conversations about it with layman Pascal after the fact. And so the concept and the details have been unpacked at length by us. And so I'm going to go through the article briefly, but then also try to bring it to life and try to provoke with it and make an ask towards the Stoa community. Because I have kind of pressured Peter to be a mimetic mediator, which is kind of his self-written, self-authored destiny, as it were, and to set up anti-debates and stuff with me and other people. And it's just, it's either not happening or it's behind schedule. So, I'm not going to call out people, but I am going to name a few names who are kind of my arch nemesis, right, that I kind of put Peter between, and ask the Stoa community to pressure those people, to reach out to them, to foster dialogue within these communities and other people, other communities, and ask them why they can't engage me, or why they want to pass judgments or wish me well and move on in another direction. And just briefly, those the kind of key people are Jordan Hall and Daniel Schmachtenberger, who I've written about positively. So, we don't need to rehash a lot of that. And also Benita Roy and David Fuller of Rebel Wisdom. And, I'm willing to admit we've crossed wires and, offended each other, but I'm not pulling away from a kind of epistemic conflict. I'm saying, as a sociologist, there's fallacies being committed, and there's commentary about social and political issues that deserve to be unpacked and foregrounded publicly. And as public figures, whether we're intellectuals or not, anybody who does public work and commentary should expect to get critiqued and should be available to engage, whether privately or publicly. So I'll just say that as kind of, me foregrounding this. And there was also a quote I picked up from one of Peter's blog posts. The social artist, quote, the social artist would need to have the ability to quickly spot and disarm bullshit in a way that allows the person to save face, while elegantly inviting them to a more authentic way of being. I would like to be able to do that, but it's very difficult. And also it's got to go both ways. So I haven't seen that done towards me. And so again, I kind of just try to highlight the low key kind of hypocrisy and ask people to rise to the challenge of their own standards. What else? So what is anti-intellectualism? So in my talk last time, I did mention it. I brought up the concept. This is before I'd written the article, but I brought up the concept and I raised the book and I said, this is an important piece of history. And Richard Hofstadter, a historian who wrote this book in 1963, 64, and also is very famous for another book called The Paranoid Style in American Politics. And so American history has these strong themes of anti-intellectualism and conspiracy thinking. And the commentary on those things is actually quite complex. The Anti-Intellectualism book is over 500 pages and, it won a Pulitzer Prize, and there's just too much detail to go into, but generally speaking, it's a kind of hostility and mistrust towards intellectuals, and intellectuals are not to be confused with sort of experts and scientists, right? Intellectuals are concerned with ideas and values and critique, and obviously have to be scientifically literate too. And I have a note here. I want to kind of release a pressure valve to say that this isn't supposed to be a hierarchy thing, like presuming I'm the smartest person in the room or ever. And going back to the point about Peter saying he's not an intellectual, like he has, deferred to me and says, you're an intellectual and I'm not. And I mean, that's only because I kind of have a different educational background and I aspire to be in this kind of public capacity to give voice to a sociological approach. And so the point I want to make is that, on some level, we're all idiots. I think I've got the capacity to make mistakes and be dumb and, make gaffes, and that's fine. I can entertain those kinds of mistakes in others. I think it's just, and Peter practices intellectual humility. But I just urge that we all kind of instead of being offended if somebody's called an idiot or being idiotic, just to recognize that we all have that capacity and we all have different historical arcs where we've been through a lot of bullshit. Some people come from religious fundamentalist backgrounds or, fundamentalist kind of political persuasions. And, even with that, we're still attracted to these high-minded ideas, right? And these systems change type, lexicons and toolkits and stuff, right? So it's a double-edged sword. We just have to acknowledge that not just individuals can be idiots, but we really live in a kind of paradoxical society that is very advanced on one hand and very dumb and regressive and violent on the other. Okay, so that's about 10 minutes. So I'm going to go to kind of my review of this article. So it's titled Anti-Intellectualism in American Strife, to contrast Hofstadter's title of American Life. And I open with a prologue on think tanks, because I've always been interested in think tanks. And when I was younger, I thought, well, that's where the intellectual stuff is happening, right? You get a bunch of smart people together in a room and it just there's a kind of synergy. And, in theory, that works, but the research on think tanks itself is quite damaging. This scholar, Thomas Medvedz, writes that they're essentially biased lobbying firms in disguise quite often, right? They're corrupted by their funders and by different interests and blind spots. And, because of that institutional kind of framework, they can't see outside in, they can't see how the critique works against them. And even the New York Times, which is eminently critiquable as a media organization, published a series on think tanks in 2018 that was quite damning. And so, I use this as a starting point because these are supposed to be kind of, public sociology institutions, and they end up just having the kind of pretense of such and operating under that kind of assumption, but actually causing problems. And the kind of, case in point is something like climate change denial, which I'll touch on a bit later. It's like there's think tanks that exist. Their sole purpose is to kind of manufacture denial and foster doubt around the scientific consensus around these concepts. So then there's downstream effects that you create little cottage industries of people that then participate in that discourse and profit off that and become kind of climate lukewarmers. And then, eventually, by the time it reaches the public, it's just people kind of talking past each other and shouting each other. And so the think tanks is a good introduction because it speaks to the depth of the meta crisis that our media discourse, our political discourses, how we look at wealth inequality and class is all distorted. And there's thousands of think tanks and, varying degrees of notability, and they're competitive. And so at the end of the day, it's like, okay, where is the net benefit? There's a lot lost. So I transition, I in that section, I also reference the past critiques I've made and kind of suggest that this is a kind of capstone to those critiques. This is a kind of meta-analysis of the conceptual framework I've been working from for years. And it's very hard to say, well, what is intellectualism? On the other hand, it's very, that would take longer to unpack than anti-intellectualism. But anyways, in the next section, in the introduction, I kind of talk about, George W. Bush and Donald Trump. And, it's not that they're not intelligent. They're incredibly, savvy kind of managers and manipulators and, script readers. It's worked. They've been very functional in their kind of agenda. But there's no question, like the language they use is like meant to dumb people down and appeal to the lowest common denominator and to appear stupid, right? So George Bush and Trump, they kind of own the fact that people are hostile towards them. And then I detail some statistics about declining American standards and declining American empire, just things like education basically crumbling. And these are not by any stretch inevitable trends, right? These are the results of the overdetermined trends of anti-intellectualism and conspiracy thinking, which are kind of generated by undercutting the public sphere, right? By privileging the private sphere, the market space, over public education and public money and access to, knowledge as a public good. And so obviously, under the broad umbrella of the end of capitalism, that, we've been on an increasing kind of trajectory and hypernormalization, as Adam Curtis calls it, of things along these metrics getting worse instead of better. So, and then I mentioned briefly something that I've been very close to, which is the Bernie Sanders political revolution, if we can call it that. It was certainly aspiring, and there was just a hostility towards it, right? And that fundamentally is a kind of anti-intellectualism because it was doing all the talking for the Bernie Sanders movement. Like there was literally a Bernie blackout, both cycles. And, Vice made a documentary about it. I think it was called Bernie Blackout. And so, I mean, these things are just, pretty transparent. But the most troubling thing for me was even in intellectual spaces, right? Like Game B, I couldn't talk about these issues. It wasn't permitted. It wasn't enabled in any way. And so it's just, again, it's a hostility towards that movement and a demonization of people in that movement to say, oh, they're Bernie bro, and they're communists, right? And so it's a kind of inversion to say that, we're the anti-intellectuals perhaps. But broadly speaking, there's these terms everybody should know, like dogmatism, pseudoscience, ideology, fundamentalism, right? These are building blocks of anti-intellectualism. And as I note in that section, again, I think climate change is a good example, just the suppression of that knowledge. It actually goes back like 70 to 100 years of kind of reporting about the prospects of climate change, of global warming, of resource depletion and whatnot. And so rather than just reiterate Hofstadter, right, I'm not trying to just revive that era and that mode of thinking. It needs to be updated. So the next section is called the critical context. And so since 2016, we've been in a post-truth era, right? That's what one of the dictionaries, says the word of the year at that time. And so in this post-truth era, it's like anything goes, it's hyper postmodern and everything's relative and lies prevail over truth. And the 2016 election, of course, was a kind of watershed moment in that, where not only did Trump beat Hillary Clinton beat Bernie Sanders, right? And there was a lot of kind of backstabbing and just malicious, like underhanded, dirty politics, right? Which again, I consider anti-intellectual. And so, a couple terms I wrote to kind of, capture what I think is the anti-intellectual spirit these days is like erroneous exclusivity, or self-interested wrongness, trying to just block out what's not working, right? And in terms of the feeling, it would be like cognitive dissonance, right? And I think there's a lot of cognitive dissonance out there because there's so much knowledge and potential. People can create their own kind of discourse, right? And that's what these different intellectual spaces do. They like figuratively construct a bubble and say, this is who's in, this is who's out, this is who we are going to, boost, and this is who we're going to denigrate and silence. And I'm just generally saying that in itself, I think, is anti-intellectual. And again, I unpack how the problem is overdetermined. That's why it's so hard to undo. It's overdetermined by factors like poverty, access to education, the media being biased and influenced by capital. And, not to demonize masses and people who are sort of disinterested or willfully ignorant, but it's the government's role to educate their population, right, in a way that they can participate and contribute. And from that, the next sub point I have is the lack of emotional intelligence, which, again, ironically, coming from the people who talk about emotional intelligence, there seems to be a serious lack, because they can't entertain a kind of socialist or radical perspective. They just jump on the bandwagon of this anti-SJW kind of zeitgeist, right? That is captured all of this political wave of centrism. And the centrism is a whole other conversation. The next section I call revisiting and revisioning. So again, here I'm invoking other sources, contemporary sources, and also going back to Hofstadter and being critical of Hofstadter. So there's one article called "The Tea Party is Timeless," And it's a kind of review and celebration of Hofstadter's book. And kind of looking back after 50 years, right? And so it's about the Tea Party, right, as a kind of intellectual, anti-intellectual movement, right? I mean, but motivated by economic populism, but fundamentally anti-intellectual, and obviously not actually geared towards economic justice, even though that's what people need. So there's that example, and then just a basic critique of Hofstadter, that he missed in the 60s, as prescient and well researched as the book is, there's nothing about race or gender, right? So it's very tone deaf in that sense, that those things in the 60s were starting to be foregrounded, and the student movement was emerging, and Hofstadter was essentially against that. And so, it's just important to contextualize Hofstadter as an intellectual who himself is not perfect and has blind spots, and perhaps were hard to see at the time, and we can only kind of really understand in retrospect. And then, I have a bit here about the examples Hofstadter gives, just to make this concrete for people, like, he lists a bunch of exhibits, kind of right-wing hostility to universities, McCarthyism, contempt for left intellectuals, Department of Defense defunding pure research, and Eisenhower himself disparaging intellectuals, even though, ironically, Eisenhower spoke to the dangers of the military-industrial complex. So I think obviously there's tensions there, right? Like, Eisenhower had a job to do, but then by the end of his presidency, he's like, yeah, maybe this isn't such a good thing, and the word egghead becomes a pejorative. So again, the general sense of anti-intellectualism historically is the kind of skepticism and disinterest in the life of mind, right? Philosophical practice, academic production. And again, these things are imperfect, but they're necessary, right? I almost think we need to double down on those things, and overfund, women's studies and Black studies and all this. So yeah, and so my next section is even more kind of revisionism of Hofstadter. I call it rethinking thinking. And again, I kind of pick up from another source that reviews and critiques Hofstadter. And here we get a nice abstraction of Hofstadter. This author, Rigney, basically says there's 3 kinds of anti-intellectualism, and briefly, the first is anti-rationalism, the second is anti-elitism, and those are pretty basic and interesting, but it's the third kind that I'm interested in, and that's unreflective instrumentalism, right? So thinking instrumentalism, meaning just thinking about, these matters in instrumental terms, like utilitarian terms, like, okay, what is the outcome? What is good for me? If I benefit, then everyone benefits, kind of thinking, right? But if it's unreflective, what that means is the devaluation of knowledge and know-how that does not have an obvious incentive or practical application, right? And so people can dismiss like something like, I don't know, music history or something, because they don't think it's useful to them. But, it can be, obviously. And so, it's good to have an open, curious mind and consume all these things in reflective ways, continually recursive, reflexive, growing as a thinker, because we're all on that path forever. Regardless of where you're at. And I'm still learning. I'm still being self-critical. So I also, just to quickly mention 5 logical fallacies. I linked to an article that gives 15, but I picked out 5 because they just seem so common to me and so common amongst intellectuals, right? Like, people, again, who are ostensibly smart, just committing these fallacies. And so the first is willful ignorance. just choosing not to be informed by something, like rejecting some consultation, or, rejecting information that contradicts your view. Whataboutism, meaning a propagandic technique where criticisms are deflected by raising corresponding criticisms of the opposite side. So, like, oh, what about this? It's a way to shift the focus, right, from what is the most important thing. My favorite, which I hate, is contrarianism. So people taking up a contrarian position just for the sake of sounding smart or feeling smart or whatever. So the definition is, quote, in science, the term contrarian is often applied to those who challenge or reject the scientific consensus on some particular issue. So, again, being a contrarian about climate change, just because you can say, oh, look at this think tank report. It says, climate alarmism is crazy. It's a little bit just dishonest at the end of the day, because one should actually listen to what the climate change discourse is saying. It's not all apocalyptic. Some of it is just pretty basic. Just, this is what's happening. These are the potential downstream effects. Collapse is a reality. And the other two are denialism and self-deception. And those are quite self-evident. So there's, okay, we got 3 minutes left. I'm just gonna rush through the end here, but so that's kind of a review. And then I pivot in the next few sections, right? So the next section is intellectual sociology. And there's a great source, this scholar, Steve Fuller, writes The Sociology of Intellectual Life. It's a powerful book. He talks about epistemic justice, which is sort of thinking of justice and equality in terms of access to information and like applied knowledge, being able to operate in the world, like whether like soda is bad for you or not. That's a public health issue of epistemic justice, right? And if media and think tanks can't effectively communicate this, then we have a crisis. And we do have many crises, right? The kind of, the pandemic and just healthcare generally. So Fuller identifies psychologism as the kind of culprit, and that's the reductionism to mental processes to explain everything, right? And I've talked about this in other places where I just feel like there's a massive like disproportionality between what people know or think they know about psychology and what they know about sociology, right? Psychology is psychologists are very esteemed. Sociologists are kind of relegated, right? Psychology is more individual and accessible. Sociology is more abstract and macro, right? So there's these reasons for the unbalance, but I think it's hurt the world, right? And the 20th century has been organized around the individual, with obviously failed attempts at the collective, but the 21st century needs to really split the difference and favor a kind of sociological enlightenment, right? And that's that, we can't pull our bootstraps up, and I can't teach the world, Peter can't teach the world. We need to really advocate for the enlightenment and the reinvestment in universities and expansion of access to these things. And it's a lot of it's going online with the pandemic, right? So we need to keep increasing access to that. I give it as an example, the invisible hand of the market. It's often taught as part of econ and sort of part of history, but it is a kind of pseudoscientific concept. It's part of the, what Fuller calls the genealogy of anti-intellectualism, right? Going back to Adam Smith, because this invisible hand is a comfortable metaphor, but it doesn't really exist. And so what he's doing is highlighting the role of public intellectuals as a kind of crisis monger, loyal opposition, devil's advocate. And that's what I try to fulfill as a role. I try to, and I'm not just an autonomous agent. Like, I follow people like Noam Chomsky, right? Who was a kind of lifetime public intellectual. And perhaps before I run out of time, it's a good opportunity to, bring him in, because I watched the talk, and of course it wasn't a lecture on anti-intellectualism, sorry, it wasn't a lecture on the responsibility of intellectuals. It was a Q&A, sort of titled that. And, it was a bit disappointing in that regard, because I think, aspiring intellectuals have a responsibility to, kind of follow the right people, kind of be faithful to the project, and Chomsky is very multifaceted and broad in this regard. Like, he's an activist, he's a world-renowned linguist and sort of political scientist. And so, what I find anti-intellectual is to say to Chomsky, "Oh, I've been a fan of yours for 40 years, can you answer my question?" But then, that person was not a Bernie supporter, did not pay attention to Noam Chomsky's activism during the last 5 years. And so I find it hypocritical and anti-intellectual. And I think we need to go headlong into that paradox. Right? We need to challenge that rather than just sort of play the game of wanting to, be adjacent to this prestigious man. Because I have massive respect for him and other people. And of course, that doesn't mean he doesn't make mistakes too and isn't above reproach. The point is really to mentally work with people like him, right? To get into his world and his building blocks, and then you can think critically, right? And this is why kind of Noam Chomsky, does a ton of research, but then when he's asked about Jordan Peterson, he goes, just go read Nathan Robinson's article, kind of dismisses Peterson, because Peterson is not a responsible public intellectual in any shape, or, any way, shape, or form. And I touched on this in the last talk. And so my attempt in this talk was to kind of bring things full circle and to say, keep urging us to do better. And just very briefly, I don't have time, but the last section of my article here is about autocritique. And it's a really interesting concept. I think there's more to be developed there. There's a bit of a kind of lineage in the literature, but it's basically, it goes beyond critique into critique the premises of the self and society. So this is something I urge is briefly put, the autocritique is an examination of conscience and a self-critique that is anticipatory, proactive, and context sensitive of the kind of assumptions we're operating under. So of course, like, war is a case in point. So like, when, everyone gets on the bandwagon for the Iraq war, where's the autocritique? Where's the people, and of course there's lots of it, you just don't hear it. But it's like, okay, war itself is bad, we know that, and it's going to be run by mercenaries essentially, so maybe we shouldn't do that. And there's even like interview footage of Dick Cheney in 1994 saying, invading Iraq would be a bad idea because it would create a power vacuum. And then they do it anyways. So the thrust of this is, in the context of some of my fields too, like metamodernism, is, post 2000, post 9/11, we're in a very different context globally. And for one reason or another, the meta narrative is still lagging. It's not caught up to the fact that a paradigm shift should be underway already, and the kind of the global public and alterity, the subaltern, the oppressed, they've been pushing for it for a long time. And it's time to start listening to them and to their real intellectual interlocutors. So that's 35 minutes. Let's stop there. Pass it on.
All right. Thank you, Brent. So now we're going to move to part 2 of the session, and I'll stop recording in a moment, but I'll just record the rules. So we're going to engage in a brief meditation, and after that meditation, that's going to pivot to the collective conversation. And how that conversation is going to be conducted. For those of you who are familiar with the collective presencing that happens here Friday, it's going to be similar to that. If you're called to say something, just unmute yourself and speak whatever feels most alive for you. Ideally out of those 4 categories that I posted above: what you agree with, what you disagree with, what triggered you, or what kind of thoughts emerged. So we'll be here for maybe a little bit for an hour. We're here 90 minutes total. I do have to prepare for another session. And let's see, what else am I missing? So yeah, there's one hard rule. Our guest today, Brent, has to remain silent for 20 minutes. So he just has to listen for 20 minutes. And then so just pay attention to the chat, Brent, and I will privately tag you in saying you can come in anytime you feel after the 20 minutes is over. So there's 3 guidelines for this group conversation. This is one big group. There's no breakout rooms. So guideline number 1, say only what you believe to be true. If you're a regular at the Stoa, you do this anyways. Number 2, do not police the conversation where it goes. If it goes in often weird territories, kind of let it. The group intelligence will eventually bring it back. So don't feel like you have to keep it in one space. And then share the conversational airspace. If you find yourself talking over other people, or just some people want to jump in, but maybe they're shy, they just need some space. So if you feel like you're talking too much, give the room some air to breathe. So that being said, before we jump into the meditation, any questions about that, clarifying questions, just write in the chat right now, and I'll give a moment to for you who have that, and I'll respond. If not, I'll stop record. Cool. All right, so we're going to stop recording.